Hi folks, this is Chris from Airwindows, and here we are with another Q&A. And as you can see, there's also a little detail up here that I'm going to try to incorporate, because I do my best to deal with things and so I've got a little text box now that will show whatever question I highlight. So we can try to orient things a little bit more along the lines of being able to keep track of stuff. As you know, I'm not very good at keeping track of stuff because my intuitive nature means I bounce all over the place, but I can at least have stuff on the screen. Maybe I can even fool with it. That's probably fine. Let me see whether I can fool with it some. Oh, drop shadow. Hold on, I'm trying to figure out whether or not I can make a background here. Meh. Doesn't really matter. We'll make it be bigger, and we'll put it there, and then we'll not worry about it too much because I can update that as I see fit. I do have to keep saving it in the file that I'm using, but that's fine. So hey, here we are, and I have just released tape. As usual, I'm doing a series of experiments. Like there's the text for when I'm going to be able to do the question. I've got my lighting is slightly different, and I'm working on some new stuff. Get a load of this. I'm going to make myself a little Eurorack thingy for the purpose of doing the same thing I was doing with this, which is wiring jacks and capacitors together to do specific things. So if anybody's curious, I can talk about that a little bit. It depends upon how much relevant stuff we actually have to talk about. And I've still got the stream time at 1 hour and 38 minutes, but we'll probably run over a little bit. And because there's no way that my Patreon income would have blown way past 1 hour and 38 minutes in a big hurry, so I'm sure it's fine. So yeah, I see people in the chat. One thing I would really enjoy is if I was able to overlay that in the same text field thing, but to do that I'd have to be able to log into YouTube's live chat and run it to a file. And I don't know if I know how to do that. People seem to like tape. I'm glad of that because it was very much my idea of how that was supposed to be. It's really important to me to do stuff in such a way where you're not buried in endless fiddling. There's a lot of musical things or a lot of even just mixing related things that die if you have to spend your entire time thinking about what little fussy setting on your software is set to what. I've got some coffee. It's nice hot coffee, so I might not be cool enough to drink just yet. And I don't have my pen and paper handy because there's always going to be something I forget. If I really have to, I can go and get it. Let's assume I don't need that today. So yeah, Kobe Bryant, that's one of the things about, you can never tell when something is going to come and just whack you depending upon the kind of life that you live. Kobe Bryant is maybe less likely to randomly keel over from physical health ailments because he'd be able to afford like healthcare. But on the other hand, he was using helicopters to fly places. And there are dangers involved in that too. So yeah, I'm going to start looking for questions and tack them up in this little question being asked place. And yeet over my little screen for doing that. And I'll see what I can do with those things. Bo mentions evergreens might be coming back. Yeah, I think that I can probably do that if I treat it as just another sort of release. Like, if I handle it in such a way where I'm respecting the time and energy commitment that it is. So if I don't have anything super key, like tape, for instance, coming out plugin-wise, I could take a week and be like, okay, I'm just going to spend extra time on the plugin and not rush it. And then I will sit down and do an evergreens, because I have had an idea for, like, I was going through some Peter Gabriel records that I got recently, and I discovered that there was something that I could say about them and demonstrate about them that would fit into the evergreens concept, because no single one of those Peter Gabriel albums was that relevant to what I do that I was going to make it be a single evergreens, but the group of 4 that just have Peter Gabriel in the same font on the cover. And I might add "so" to that, although it's different, but it's sort of part of the same stream. Tells a production story. Like the very first one is sort of late 70s, extremely rich and deep and warm, and like tapey and neavy and whatever, which is not to say that I know that that's what they used, but the last one, which I believe was called Security, of that 4-album set. And amusingly, one thing I love about that is that those 4 albums are each on different labels. Every single album of that set has the same title logo and the same Peter Gabriel on the cover, but they're all coming off of different record labels, which is amazing to me that he could do that and get away with it. And that latter one, Security, has the song "Shock the Monkey" on it. And you can hear the point that they switched to like SSLs and mixing to digital. Because digital hit like literally right at the end of the 70s. I think, if I'm not mistaken, who was it? Joe Jackson? Somebody like that was doing the Rycoder Bop Teardrop, maybe? Not Joe Jackson? Somebody did the first digitally mixed album, or mixed to digital album, and at that point it started to really go. Like, for instance, Fleetwood Mac's Tusk was mixed to digital, and it doesn't sound the same as Fleetwood Mac or Rumors, because it has some of the characteristics of that early digital, which is, here, let's update the da-da-da. Oh, I'm going to have to move that around if I expect it to fit. So the Fleetwood Mac's Tusk was mixed to digital, and you can tell that it's got this sort of extra glossiness and sort of a certain coldness and spaciousness and enhanced dynamic range. Because one of the things about early digital or modern DAW digital is that there's a certain spikiness you can get about the dynamics that is not the same as what you've got from analog. And to get that kind of dynamic punch out of analog, you had to do like Pink Floyd with The Wall and just gain stage everything really carefully. I'm not sure Stevie Wonder was the first to go digital, no. So I got some more questions. I shouldn't just only talk about production. I mean, I can do that, but I shouldn't only talk about production. Maybe I'll move this screen over so that I'm not looking at my face all the time. There we go. So, yeah, the new Waza asks a specific question, which is the new tape plugin. And let's update this to go. With the new, oh man, hang on, I gotta fuss with stuff a little bit. This is not doing what I wanted. Do I have text editing controls on this? I don't know. Looks like I don't. Looks like this is going to be fuzzy to me and not quite what I had hoped. Well, that's okay. You can't always have the same glorious result of like screen flow, which is not glorious itself, but so first question, if I don't drive it and leave it on 0, is there still an effect? Yeah, if you leave it on 0, not only is there still an effect, but there's still a particular type of distortion and everything kind of work. The slam control is a control inside of on-box, which is the way that it does its distorting. Stan Stees asks, I recently checked out to tape 6. Let's fool with this and see whether I can handle questions by literally copying and pasting them, and whether it fits on my screen properly or not. Oh, yeah, this is going to be a lot of work, guys. Forgive me for having to fiddle with it a lot. There's nothing convenient about any of this. So we'll see how well this goes. So I recently checked out to tape 6. I'm going to be moving windows around and fussing with stuff lots. Forgive me for the royal mess of this. But hey, your question's on the screen, so woo. Why is it so much tamer than to tape 5? A couple of reasons. One is it is using slight changes on pretty much everything. Everything has been fooled with. The soften control is not the same soften control as the previous one. The tape bump is not being added in the same place as the previous one. The distortion algorithm isn't density anymore. Instead, it is, for to tape 6 specifically, it's the Mojo algorithm, which has a sort of fat tapey quality. And just plain tape by itself is spiral. It's designed to be cleaner. So let me see for a second. Well, I'm fussing with stuff a little bit because even though I hey, so I can kind of try to work things that way. So the reason to tape 6 is that much tamer than to tape 5 is because there's a lot of other stuff going on. You'll also note that tape itself is tamer than to tape 6 in some ways. That's because I'm moving towards being able to work with it. Trees intro screen. Oh, you mean this? That's a photograph that I took off the top of Putney Mountain a really long time ago. It's so old that it is on film and went to a CD image scanning burning company where they were able to give me a spectacularly high resolution thing of about like 1600 by 1200, which was amazing at the time. That was like sending your scans off to have them sent back to you in CD form and higher resolutions than you could ever see in any other way. And these days, everything kind of leaves that in the dust. But still, that was a professionally scanned film negative that I shot in a camera. So that was kind of fun. Oh, also the camera that I'm using for blogging now blows away the old film camera, with the exception that the old film camera was still film and did have some sort of like analog mojo going with it. I wonder whether I can give myself a little more room for that. There we go. I don't know whether the first Peter Gabriel album was produced by Bob Ezrin. So one of the things about this teamness factor that is certainly a part of what I did is that like real tape is not so wild of a coloring factor. It doesn't smear and fuzz everything out like crazy. In fact, there's a lot of verisimilitude that you get off of it. So going for something that works like real tape doesn't end up being just, the smear and distortion and fuzz and everything. It's a lot more well-behaved than you would expect. And that's one of the things that I demonstrate with the Evergreens series, is that stuff, with some exceptions that I generally highlight, is all done to tape, but you don't find it like, ooh, super blurry. Instead, you listen to the Evergreen series that patrons have access to and go, wow, that sounds amazingly realistic. Because they don't tend to think of stuff from that era as being amazingly realistic, and yet that's one of the things that the formats had available to them. Like, we had lots of noise. We had wow and flutter and all that, although flutter was not as intense as you thought. People tend to model that kind of thing, and if you're putting it in a plugin, you have to put a substantial amount in, otherwise people are like, you didn't put it in, I don't hear it, But on the whole, that stuff was pretty darn convincing, especially when somebody like Abbey Road were responsible for handling it. They did a pretty good job of it. So the reason that recent 2-tapes are tamer than 2-tape 5 and earlier is because I learned more and I got more freedom to, rather than having to sell to a plug-in audience that demanded certain things and otherwise I wouldn't sell, I got more freedom, thanks to the Patreon and such, to do it the way it actually was done, regardless of what a audience of paying customers would expect and demand, and be able to hurt your sales by being like, I don't know, man, it doesn't sound as much mojo as X, Y, Z, whatever. So yeah, I'm having a look at some of these questions and things. Oh, here's Affirmation Audios asking a complicated question. Let me take a minute and format that into my new question thing. This is going to take me a while, so forgive me for that. Or actually, maybe it won't. No, I'd have to screw over the text editing to do that. Let's see how this fits on the screen. Not super well. Okay. Don't mind me playing with the text. This might take me a while. On the other hand, if I can successfully do this, then people can actually see what's being asked, and it'll keep me focused. So this will take some time. Please forgive that. Hey, reformatted. There we go. So, The question I have highlighted and put on screen is, do you think it would be possible to create an EQ which records the phase on input, does its processing, and shifts the phase back to how it was, not changing it at all? What do you mean by phase? That's an odd question, as to, like, what you've got is frequencies and a waveform that doesn't inherently have a phase. Phase can be changed, like with, say, a phase rotator, but mostly when we talk about phase, we talk about, like, EQs causing phase to lag, like the way that it works, the high frequencies get somewhat delayed. And this is also a factor of analog equipment at times, so it becomes part of how you get your sound. I do not think there is a way that you can do the processing. You could shift the audio back after the processing to dry again and not change the audio at all. But phase is inherent in what you've got for sounds. So if you're changing the sounds, you're changing the frequency, and you're changing the phase, and you're changing all of these things. And it becomes a question of, did it happen in a way that you like? The idea of doing stuff like linear phase, I've spoken repeatedly about how you don't necessarily want linear phase, because linear phase means you will have pre-echo. And pre-echo is worse than phase irregularities. Indeed, a lot of the stuff that you might want to do for shaping tone in certain ways, like you can have high quality audio from nice gear, like, an API pre that has transformer balanced inputs and outputs. A bunch of the stuff that I'm using, like what you're hearing now, is going through so many transformers you wouldn't believe it. It's a condenser mic, this one right here, and it's going through an input transformer, and there's an output transformer on the preamplifier, and then it's going into a mixer, and the mixer has a input and output transformer on its gain stage, although the inputs to the mixer are just sort of simple resistance networks and submixes, but the gain makeup part of it is a sort of Neve type thing, and it's working in balanced form using transformer inputs and outputs, and it's running through an effects loop where the compressor that I'm using is doing its thing, and the compressor also has transformer balanced inputs and outputs. So that is 6 high quality transformers in the signal path, and yet it doesn't sound completely screwy to you because the phase shifts that these transformers apply are not hurting the sound. The phase shifts that these transformers apply are sort of band limiting and containing things in a way that's musically useful. So you're still getting, deep lows. Actually, I can fuss with this a little bit. I didn't really set it up for voice. It's more or less set up for voice. But you get some deep lows going through the transformers, but there's a limit to how much they can pass, and they can't pass DC under any circumstances. That's one of the things that tape involved. That tape is even better than 2-tape 6 as far as rejecting subsonic thumps and frequencies and stuff. It's even more of a, like, you don't need a DAW-based high-pass filter for like mastering or something if you're working on something that was mixed using tape as an output stage, because tape will deliver a lot of huge lows, but it's cutting off the extreme DC type behavior very, very assertively. So yeah, let me skip ahead to another question, because that one required so much so just for fun. So going on to the next question, there's a question, how to eliminate snare string buzz from recording. First of all, let me see whether I can copy and paste this. And secondly, let's see how well I can fit it into the space reasonably well. So here's the thing. As far as eliminating snare string buzz from recording, I don't agree that you want to do that. You might feel like you want to do it, but like there are some ways people do that kind of thing, but they have a big cost. You can tape the snares to the snare head of your drum. You can use a smaller snare. You could tighten up the snare, which will actually make it buzz more harshly when it does buzz on amp sounds. I'm presuming that what you're getting is buzz off of extraneous sounds also happening during the time of recording, and that you are maybe trying to mix down stuff, including a bunch of mics, such as, for instance, a snare, an under snare mic. I don't know whether that's what you're doing, but that might be a case where it would become really obnoxious. You might be boosting the highs on the snare to the point where it becomes obnoxious. You might be doing any number of things where you're trying to get almost a hi-hat-like brightness out of the snare, but accentuating the problems of having extraneous sounds in there. And there's two approaches to that. One of them would be to control the recording situation, because if the snare is sort of loose and rattly, the buzzes will not be as striking and sharp as if it was a really tight snare or a really well-controlled snare, but they'll happen in every little noise. Hey, says scroll down, Chris. Well, it's already scrolled down. So basically what you're saying is a read on. Wave given to me by somebody can't access the kit. It's a badly recorded wave. I want to retain the highs without the snare buzz. You might be, as we call it, shit out of luck there. Yeah, there are a lot of things where. So here's where some of these I can bring a little more. You say you don't know the exact frequency of a snare string. It doesn't have one. Snare buzz is white noise. Snare buzz is a wide range of frequencies. It's not a frequency. So that's part of your problem there. If you're working on only an overall recording, there's nothing you can do. If you're working on isolated mics, you can gate them and try to, or you can use something like density on an inverse setting so that you duck out the quieter sounds more. But there is no frequency. There is no frequency. Even if you were getting a resonant note and it's making the snare squawk, the note might be a frequency, but the squawk is not. The squawk is a buzz, and that is a full frequency artifact that's happening. So, yeah. You're not going for gating. Yep. You might find it impossible, yeah. Roberto asks, do you have a plugin that can automate control parameters of another? Nope. But you might look into Blue Cat stuff for that. And, for example, I'd like to use tape 6 in my master bus. I would think go ahead. Which is not to say that everything that it does lends itself to automating. But you see, what you're looking... I'm going to start isolating just tiny little snippets of things. So Roberto's talking about this, and it doesn't fit on my screen. Darn it. So Roberto's talking about this, and having the flutter parameter progressively increase. What you want to do is use the DAW to automate the plugin. I mean, these are generic plugins. So, like, regardless of what you're using, those controls ought to be available. I'm not sure what you're using, and I don't know the use of all DAWs. I do know that if you were using Logic, damn straight you could automate that. It's completely accessible. I don't know to what extent Reaper allows that, and I have not ever experimented much with automating in Reaper, so I That's probably something I need to learn, in my copious free time. But that is the thing where that's the DAW's job. Like, I'm not going to write a plugin to automate my plugins that can already be automated by the DAW, because that's the DAW's job. That's what the DAW does. Let me look forward. See, this is starting to really bug me that I can't make this work the way that I want. Let me see whether I can hard wrap to okay, that's interesting. I am going to copy Jack's comment out, and then I'm going to try to make it so that my text thingy here automatically does what I want. Ooh boy, it sure didn't. Okay, forgive me while I fuss with this. I'm fussing with this. Hard wrap at 40 characters. That's not good. Hard wrap at 30 characters? Also not good. Hard wrap at 20 characters. This is going to get really messy. Forgive me. I've never worked with this before, so bam, 24 characters. So the question is, I'm looking to emulate a 16-channel analog summing box used at 8 stereo outputs. Yeah, basically what you're going to want to do is use a console system. Channel isn't necessary. Bus colors isn't necessary. What I'm going to be trying to do, somebody is scrolling us off. Let me quickly glance at our, actually no, tell you what, I'll scroll past that once I'm done. We'll leave it at the bottom. So yeah, we'll catch up with things when somebody has a real question. That will now just keep scrolling off the bottom of the screen, and I can make the chat vanish from the stream if I need to. So word of the wise. Or I can put it in top chat. I bet that's not going to show up in top chat. Stephen, oh no wait, we're still talking about the emulating the 16-channel summing box. Basically that's what console is for. And stuff like channel and bus colors are color adders. It depends upon how much color you want to add to the analog summing thing. Like right now, I would advocate don't worry so much about that stuff. You can use the most recent channel if you'd like to sort of fatten things up a little bit, because that's mostly what it's good for, is bringing things a little more up front. And you'd be using like console, probably 6. I think there's a console 7, but it was extremely intense. And go to tape on the 2 bus after the console bus plugin. And that ought to do what you're looking for, as far as a 16-channel analog summing box is not going to throw lots of color at you. It's going to be relatively subdued. So you don't necessarily want to exaggerate stuff super hard. So Stephen, let's see. Stephen likes tape. Yeah, I'm going for something here. The purpose of making certain things and putting them out as the most generic possible description is that I'm moving towards the sort of director's cut set that will do what Jack was looking for. The emulating a thing and not getting buried in a million choices. I have more than 180 plugins in new updates.zip. It's not reasonable to expect people to dig through all that anymore, so I need to put out a selected set of plugins, and what I'm currently doing, and tape is a key part of that, is coming up with very basic, simple versions of the building block things that you need to know about learning the mix, so that you can put it together and have it be very direct and basic, not funny names on things or whatever, but just your basic building blocks. And then if that's not enough, you start digging through new updates.zip and you start trying to find other stuff to incorporate. I need to build a fundamental basics kit, and that is coming. It'll happen as an actual product release, much the same as plugins would. And it's fairly high in priority, but I feel like I want to incorporate a couple of other things before coming out with that. It's certainly going to be early in 2020 that I start putting that out, and at that point it'll become telling people that's what you should get if you're starting out, and also making videos showing people how that works. And that involves like using my recordings and such, and rather than using the analog mixing system I've assembled, catching stuff directly off the multi-track, because I have the capacity to grab stuff off of my mix as individual tracks and then reconstruct the work that I'm doing in analog in the box. So that I've put a lot of work in the last half year or so at getting to a point where I can make that possible. And it is like, I just haven't done it yet because there's always something else to do, but it's increasingly to the point where I'll be able to do it. Probably the first you'll see it is when I do release that kit of selected plugins that's your, baby's first Airwindows mix framing. And at that point, it'll probably be in Reaper, although I could do it in Logic as well, just for sort of extra coverage. And at that point, you'll be seeing screen capture again, and you'll be seeing like lots of windows from the computer showing all of the stuff that's happening, and you'll be seeing how I would lay out plugins to do that thing. That's when that'll happen, is when I have the Airwindows mix pack together. And that's also when it'll become a thing of like assembling additional mix packs, like an Airwindows mastering pack, which is a different set of stuff selected for the purpose of being able to work on two-track stuff effectively. So let's continue. It is 11:39, so I got about an hour to go. And Zafor is mentioning interstage with different tone settings would be a workflow and hint. And interstage is a whole other thing. Interstage is another sort of analog coloring device. You can think of it as like a one-stop EQ. So I don't remember it as having any settings. It's just a unit that you stick in there. Ahmed's talking about a Melda plugin that does a very bad zero cross, but does a zero cross. I'm not really sure what a zero cross means in this context. When I think of them, I think of like my my WMD DVCA, and what that does is it'll turn a gate on or off only at zero crosses, and it'll operate at audio frequencies, but it does a very useful thing that way. Let's scroll down and see what's going on with the mess. There's the mess. So let's go and find something like what was meant by zero cross. Well, here's a question I can handle. Oop. So again, hard rep. I need to set the window to do this. Boop. So somebody is nice and positive. How do you make the plugin sound so good while at the same time being low on CPU usage? That touches on a couple of things. And one of them is I think that overprocessing hurts the sound. Like, stuff sounds better when you don't do so much to it. And this is something that also holds up in the analog sphere as well. You can have multiple ways of dealing with things. And I'm reminded of a situation where I read in the Absolute Sound magazine about two different phono preamps with different ethos. And one of them was a Jeff Rowland coherence, and the other one was, I don't know, Wadia or something elaborate. Excuse me while I shoot my telephone. You probably can't hear it. I'm just going to have to deal with the thing talking in my ear while I try to talk to you. And I have to wait until it shuts the hell up. I really wish it would never do that. It's like listening to yourself being played back into your ears. In fact, tell you what. Here. Now I can't hear it anymore, and I can try to focus. Actually, no, it stopped. It's really bad when, like, a telemarketer goes in your ear while you're trying to talk to the camera. It's not good. It's not good at all. It could be worse. I suppressed that speaker and put aluminum tape over it to try to just shut it up, because otherwise it would cause me to jump and then also be annoyed. And I'm kind of tethered to things right now, so I can't really grab the... Anyways, that's not what I was talking about. We're talking about low in CPU usage and sound. The Rowland Coherence was a phono preamplifier made with like one transistor. The kind of design where he picked just the right parts and selected just the right transistor and ultimate quality capacitors and things, and constructed a phono pre with the minimum of parts, all of which were like, gold wire and this and that. And there's another way of doing it, which is you use lots and lots and lots of parts, all sort of working together to kind of try and make things do exactly the right behavior. I need to vacuum my keyboard in here. And that's another approach. That's the approach of using more and more parts to fiddle with little details in your emulation, because you believe it's down to just addressing every tiny little thing, and there is an underlying assumption that you can do that freely and not pay a cost on each little stage. But the Rowland one is like every part hurts the sound to some extent, so we're going to use as few as possible. And I am in the Rowland camp as far as digital programming. Like, some of my stuff is using, say, a single sine function or a modified sine function, like Spiral, for instance, in the most recent release of Tape. Spiral is literally a sine function that is interpolated through to flat as it crosses zero. And there's a little algorithm that it does, but it's one line of code. The audio is being handled by one line of code, and it's being run at long double resolution. So that's part of it. Because running the trigonometry code at long double resolution is not actually low CPU usage. It's kind of excessive and wasteful, and some people will be like, oh, you should be doing that as a 32-bit float because you're just burning cycles, calculating a sine function down to this finely grained detail. But that's part of it. That's part of making this plugin sound good, is not incurring any specific digital problems at any level. And I mean any level. Like, my stuff dithers to the 32-bit or 64-bit floating point bus, because I worked out how to do that, and it seemed like a good idea to do. that the reason they sound Airwindows is because I'm doing all of that kind of stuff. Like this audio math is being done at long double resolution. That's so much overkill that most people wouldn't consider ever doing that. Nobody's stopping me from doing it, so I do it. And the reason that it's relatively low in CPU usage is modern computer CPUs are really powerful. They can do stuff like that. They can calculate real good. But also that there are few calculations being done at this extremely high fidelity. So that's basically the answer. The answer is that I'm using very high resolution in all the calculations. They're like long double resolution, they're 64 or 80-bit or whatever end up. And I pay a lot of attention to keeping specifically stuff in the resolution domain. I don't work nearly as hard on aliasing, although my recent stuff like tape, for instance, is using the unbox code, and the unbox code does resist aliasing to some extent. It basically cuts out highs as they get really high and bright, and anything that is really high and bright and producing harmonics is always going to alias. The way of dealing with aliasing is typically oversampling. And to oversample properly requires so much calculation that it's kind of opposite to the other stuff that I do. Boop. So let's use this mostly just to test the ability to so what's the difference between my distortion plugins? What generate which kind of harmonic? Yeah. Basically what's happening with the distortion plugins is they're all different flavors of the same basic thing. Like nothing is going to generate a 3.5 harmonic. That would be aliasing anyway. And generally they're all doing little variations on third and fifth and so on. And everything that is not generating a really harsh aggressive thing, it's mostly just variations on how much third harmonic are you bringing in before you start bringing in fifth and so on. And most of all, it's not even about that. It's about how do these things handle the middle of the transfer function where you're going through the non-distorted part. Because the thing about it is you can do the distortion algorithms all day long, and they do different kinds of what you call a transfer function. Transfer function means, like, at this point it's the input signal, and at this point it stops being the input signal and starts to become something else. Like, input signal goes up, and then the output cuts off, stops going up anymore. So I would say don't think of it in terms of harmonics, because harmonics are just the sort of fast Fourier transform version of the shape of the output wave. If you're dealing with analog waveforms or wave shaping or generating the waveforms, you're probably thinking more in terms of output waves. You're not really thinking in terms of which harmonics are in what. Like, stuff gets really weird. Like, there's piano strings generate harmonics, but some of the harmonics are slightly pitch shifted because the center of the piano string is a metal cylinder. And the extent to which it is a metal cylinder is the extent to which it has sort of funny other vibrations that cause the harmonics to be slightly different in pitch than a perfect stretched string might be. And so it's really tricky as far as that's concerned. And in terms of the distortion plugins, there are two factors involved. One of them is what way does it handle rounding off and stopping to get any louder when it distorts. There's also other things having to do with like the exact shape of the contour of how it rounds off, or whether it continues to round over and go quiet again, which some of that stuff does. Like I think the original Spiral plugin does that, and that means if you start driving it even harder, it starts to sort of fart out and go quieter, which is an interesting effect that can be useful in its way. But the other aspect of it is, how does it handle the quiet part where it's not distorting? Because it's this spectrum between hard clipping and soft clipping, and there's a million ways of doing that, and there's no specific way to describe that. You got to listen for them. You got to listen to them in terms of, is this softer? Is this harder? What kind of overtones does this have? You could compare density with drive and put both of them on some kind of like jangly, like some kind of gnarly bass with a lot of overtones, like I'm talking a bass guitar. And if you distort those, it'll have a very different effect based on what kind of distortion algorithm it is, but it's difficult to describe how that goes. Like density, more thick and fat and heavy and not as clear as something like Spiral. Whereas drive, more gritty and edgy, and it's not as smooth of a contour. Instead, it sort of hardens off at a certain point. Somebody's liking Gringer on some sounds. That's nice. Anyone from China on coronavirus updates? If you want to talk about that in chat, you go ahead. I'm not going to be a news source here. We're going to try to focus on audio questions for a variety of reasons. One of them is I have also followed stuff like cartoons and things in my day. And there were times, for instance, like 9/11, where, this would happen, everybody's freaking out, and certain cartoonists went, I'm going to just do my usual cartoon because people probably could use a break and not everything is going to touch on this terrible major thing that's happened. And that's something that people could choose, and there was a certain amount of gratitude for that stuff, because you can find your information, but in many ways, like my Q&A sessions, act kind of like you can come here and get spammed by a weird troll, or talk about stuff. Hopefully I can stay on topic a little better now that I'm putting questions up on the screen. And we can like focus down into a little sort of abstract area that maybe can serve as a kind of distraction. So there's that. Stephen is talking about, it wouldn't surprise me if Airwindows plugins would work on pre-Windows XP systems. I'd like that. I'm not sure if that is the case. I'm certainly running VST 2.4, but my hope is that that will run on really old systems. That's kind of why I do what I do, the way that I do it. Foco says that Evergreens is always welcome. That's cool. I'll see if I can keep doing it. Biquad is your main filter for cutting frequencies. That's cool as well. Bear in mind, sometimes it might work for you to use Biquad 1/2. Biquad 1/2 is the interleaved plugin. So it's not going to be much help in really bright stuff, but mid-range type things, Biquad 1/2 might sound better for you. At some of the stuff that I do, I'll be choosing things like that because I'll know that inside the plugin, I know what kind of EQ I'm applying, and so therefore I can do this. Here's a privacy is asking a question. I'll grab that before it scrolls off the screen. And let me see whether I can... Well, that didn't do it. How about that? Yep, okay. Backslash. That is analog modeling fundamentally wrong? We can't even model saturation in a feedback loop without sample delay. I wouldn't say analog modeling is fundamentally wrong, but it's not analog. Analog modeling is a different thing. what I see it as is analog modeling is not going to make your plugin become the thing that you're trying to model. But a lot of the stuff that people do in analog modeling is musically useful in that you can do pure DSP stuff, like if you were analyzing waveforms in a scientific processor to isolate this or that and display it on a screen. That's something where DSP type stuff could work out really well, but getting music to sound right or getting things to sound right could very well involve extra stuff beyond what you think you're doing. Like boosting something in an analog EQ will very likely involve some phase delay and shifting of things against other things, and it's likely to also involve some saturation and nonlinearity. And it's also possibly going to involve some band limiting in terms of what you're doing. Like your frequency boost that you're applying could be in an analog circuit that also has a really striking bandpass in it, and its little internal capacitors are killing everything above a certain frequency and below a certain frequency, and that's just how they run. Especially if you've got like fancy pants stuff with transformer coupled inputs and outputs, so that you can run balanced circuitry this way and that way. That stuff all has a bunch of additional things going on besides what you think you're doing. And those could be just as useful to your end result. So analog modeling is not necessarily the same thing as taking all of the individual resistors and stuff and modeling what all of those things do. It can be generalizing what the stuff is doing in line with like, well, among other things, I know that this is going to be band limited. I know that this, for instance, Interstage, the plugin that I put out, is essentially just a band limiter. And I've done various things along those lines where you throw it on, it doesn't sound like it's doing very much, but it is applying something that often happens within analog circuitry that's easily overlooked. Hey, I've got something else I can copy. Dum-de-dum. So we'll keep going. Quick question here. So last night's video, tape and 2tape 6 as far as mastering plugins. You know, I'd recommend tape more as far as mastering plugin. I don't think you should be throwing Flutter in anybody's master. I think that's a terrible idea. You could use 2tape as a mastering plugin, and that is the context where you'd be fiddling with things like exactly how much head bump do I add to this. Very much so, in fact, because 2tape 6 will let you do some of those things like, okay, first of all, take out Flutter, it doesn't belong in a mastering. And then take out head bump and put in only as much as you need. Like tape is much more relevant to something where you're mixing into it. Mastering is not a situation where you're mixing into it. So honestly, mixing, or if your lows happen to be exactly what you're going to need, I would consider using tape on that. And certainly the spiral algorithm inside it can be kind of cleaner, but at the same time, mastering is the situation where you don't have control over how loud the low frequency thing is relative to other things. Like in mixing, tape is ideal for mixing because then you'll just sort of voice everything to work the way you want, and you don't have to fiddle with like, well, how much is this plugin adding extra head bump lows? But in mastering, you can't necessarily control that, so you might need to take out the head bump or crank it up all the way to get the result that you want. So in a way, I would say, no, they're not that interchangeable, because I never was talking about mastering in terms of this stuff. Like, you don't normally go for like analog modeling emulation stuff in a mastering context. That very rarely has usefulness. You could, but it's not really a professional move to be throwing your like analog blur and mojo and calling it mastering. Mastering is much more like surgically analyzing what's actually there and fiddling with the balances inside the two-track. And yeah, you would want to shut off the flutter. That's the sort of fundamental thing, is if you were using to tape 6 in mastering, the first thing you would do is kill the flutter and not put it back. I've got another question here, and it is always useful to have it be flagged like that. It's not indispensable, but it is handy. Explaining peaks again. So peaks only in monitor is a special kind of thing. It might be a little deceptive, and you're not supposed to make it so that it sounds good all by itself. What peaks does, Robert Kennedy is being snarky about our troll. That's fine. What peaks only does, and it on the VST it'll say just peaks, is it is like the old Silhouette plugin in a way, where it's creating a audio output that is an exaggerated version of something that you can't naturally hear super well. So if you have strong dynamic peaks happening in the lows, and you turn that on, all of a sudden they're blowing up your speakers. They're super exaggeratedly loud. If you have a lot of intense energy in peak energy in the mid-range, it'll become more obvious that that is something that is there. If your snare drum, either you've not saturated or compressed it very much, it's not very smushed, or you've compressed it in such a way that the initial spike is super loud, that should stick out extra much on peaks. Peaks is there to show you what exists in the mix. And it's also kind of if you make it so that it's not blowing up anything, then your output mix through peaks only is going to be pretty natural dynamically. It'll have a range to it, and if stuff isn't like blowing up the output with peaks engaged, you turn it back off and you've got a nice dynamic output with some headroom. If you were doing stuff for the purpose of sending it to mastering, being like, okay, this is my mix, but I'm not like clipping my mix or otherwise smashing it. Instead, I need to do a mix that moves and breathes on its own. And then the mastering engineer can make it louder if that's what they still care to do, which is a bad idea these days anyway. But if you were doing that, you'd want to enable peaks and then make it not distort stuff, which might mean turning things down. And you'd be able to hear which things needed to be turned down because they would be the things that were blowing up peaks. If stuff balances on peaks, it's likely to be a pretty respectable mix. Making things balance on peaks is going to be fairly hard, but it will be a pretty good litmus test to whether that's actually working out. I have an observation on something up here, which is biquad 1/2 does something to the highs. Need to try it out more, different tone. Yeah, biquad 1/2 is interleaved biquad filter. That's literally all it is. My biquad filter runs inside a console instance. So it's the kind of purest console where it's the stuff that you put through, if there's only one sound, it's bit identical. So it's running console to suppress only the artifacts of the biquad filter process. So that's a subtle thing, and it's being done in long double resolution, so I can get away with it without like impeding the tone very much. And since biquad 1/2 is interleaved biquad, there's a limit to how high frequency you can go, especially at 44.1K. If you're at a high frequency, like 96K or 192K, it's going to be much less limited. You'll do whatever you want. But if you're running at 44.1K, then biquad 1/2 will only be able to go up to a certain frequency before it stops working very well. And there will also be a funny little artifact around, like 10K or so. There's a little notch in there. And that's part of the interleaving process. Interstage. Interstage a bit. The thing with interstage is it's sort of my old school, this is the pre-biquad filter stuff. So interstage specifically is what I was doing when I was going to try to do what turned into focus and stuff like that, where I was going to compare my biquad filter run as a super broad bandpass. Because the thing is, if you take the biquad filter, and you have to be running it at pretty high resolution in order to be able to do this, because otherwise they die. You can't necessarily do this with biquad filters that are implemented as floats, 32-bit floats. It has to have a lot more finesse or it'll flip out. But you run the Q factor, the resonance of the filter, at whatever frequency you're at, insanely wide. And if you do a bandpass biquad filter with the resonance of almost infinitely low, what you get is this, like, all the frequencies get through. We've widened the narrowness of it out to where it lets literally everything through, but it's still going to resist the Nyquist frequency, and it's still going to resist DC voltage. It becomes this thing where you could use it as a, that bandpass stage of like running through a analog device. Such as if you're running through like some of the gear that has transformer coupled input and output stages, because transformer coupled input and output stages won't give highs past a certain point, won't give lows past a certain point. So the deal with interstage is it is not the biquad implementation of that. So interstage fails to completely suppress DC as well as a biquad filter would. It fails to completely suppress high frequencies, but it has a particular coloration to it that feels kind of like, analog filter, mojo, tone coloring kind of thing going on, kind of like channel or something. And when I did the biquad filter version of this, it didn't sound as good. It was too vanilla. It was too plain. Whereas, and I bet there's some slew limiting in interstage as well. But interstage wound up having a more nice sounding tone color. So that's what interstage basically does, is interstage is like a band limiting, but it's not a like formal band limiting like you might get from a biquad filter. Instead, it's kind of the tone coloring of a band limiting. And you can throw it on pretty much anything, anywhere. Inside console, outside console, on channels, on the tube bus, anywhere you like. And it will provide a particular sort of tone color to rolling off a little more lows and a little more highs, and a little sort of your analog mojo kind of thing going on. So basically, that's interstage. Interstage is, I don't change the tone coloring of things very much, but when I do, it sounds a little bit like analog gear. That's what that's about. And again, I draw a comparison to channel, because channel also does some of that. So yeah. Yep. Kevin is exporting masters out of Reaper and shut off Flutter. Yep. You shouldn't. The only reason it's defaulting to on is partly your just general marketing thing. If you're going to run into people who don't really know what they're doing and they're going to be like, oh, what's the new thing? And I put it on and they go, oh, wow, it's doing lots of stuff. That's really cool. I expect people to be able to dig in a little deeper and figure out what is necessary for them. But there's also some value to like the trick that so many manufacturers do to the point where you can hardly even get away from it, where you kick in the plug-in and everything's a little bit louder. That is such a common trick that you're hobbling yourself if you don't use it. And my way of dealing with that is when I have stuff where it could be level matched, but you'd have to run an extra multiplication to pad down the output to make it level matched, and also your output wouldn't go up to 0 and like full clip or near full clip. I'll choose not to do that. I'll choose to just use the simplest form of the algorithm, and if it gives a little marketing boost, then I'll admit that quite openly, but you need to run the output gain or whatever and set it to something to the point, because it might not be exactly the same in every frequency too. Like there might be stuff, the tape plugins, there's a low frequency boost that's part of the head bump, and it's not even the same low frequency boost at every volume level. Loud volume levels are going to maybe be a bit of a low frequency cut, but quiet, loud 30 hertz at full scale is going to be quieter because you're going to distort. But really quiet 30 hertz is going to be boosted quite a lot. And there's a whole compressy effect going on with that. So you can't necessarily work out what you're going to get from everything. So my choice around that is to basically not deal with it and go on the basis of everywhere I can take a gain trim and go, if the gain trim is equal to a multiplying by 1, don't do that multiplication. Because, of course, in digital, if you were multiplying a floating point number by 1.0 float, you can change the number you're multiplying it by. If it's this tiny little value that might be brought up later in the processing, and you're multiplying it at 32-bit by another float, you're going to go with the highest exponent that you need, and that can very easily gate off the bottom data that's too delicate and fine to be multiplied by something at the scale of 1, which is as loud as you can get. Therefore, I choose not to multiply if it's going to be a multiply by 1, because it's not the same thing in the computer as it is mathematically. Mathematically, if you multiply something by 1, it's always exactly the same as it was. If you're using floating point number representations, it ain't necessarily the same as what it was. And you can wind up gating the thing to 0 quite easily. So that's also what I'm avoiding when I'm not doing the gain staging everything to be exactly unity gain and going through it. And I'm quite happy to acknowledge that, because there's a lot of people who aren't acknowledging that and are also doing it very much on purpose. Mine is more of an after effect of how this stuff works. So let's see now, further questions. Here's one. I'm having difficulty selecting it, but delay plugins. Well, it's probably going to take me a little while, but one of the things that is coming, you realize there was a point where I got a Roland Space Echo, kinda. It was a 201, and it's maybe not the most optimal Space Echo, but I got a real one, and I did some measurements on it, and then it died, stopping my researches on it. But before, I did do a recording of, essentially it was a bunch of stuff with a simple sine wave from my modular synthesizers, which have all kinds of uses. It was a sine wave from my Doepfer quadrature through zero VCO, which generates sines. And so that is my test equipment. If I use that, I can get a really high quality sine wave at whatever frequency I want, as long as it's not too specific. And doing that let me get a really good sense on what the sort of flutter warble was on the Roland tape echo, and that's what went into 2 tape 6. My researches on that helped me do 2 tape 6, because I was listening to the way in which like the slight excesses of warble came in, and sort of tuned and tailored everything. What that means is that I am going to be trying to do a follow-up to tape delay, because I've got tape delay out, but that's from a long time ago. Tape delay uses the iron oxide math for stuff, so the slapbacks on that are like band limited, and they can be brighter or they can be darker. It's a whole thing on its own. You can do neat stuff with it, but when I do a tape echo plugin, which is probably, I'll literally call it that, and I'll try to make it relatively simple, but it will involve multiple tape heads, because the Space Echo has 2 tape heads at different spacings, and you can have one or the other. So probably what I would do is have distinct amplitude sliders and possibly distinct feedback sliders, or maybe not. Maybe just amplitude sliders and a single feedback slider, so that you could get that sort of more complicated echo going on. And then the tape echo plugin would also have built-in flutter that would be designed to be pretty much dead on exactly what I was getting off of the slightly old and dirty Roland while it was working. And it wasn't the transport that died. It was the tape record circuitry. And I've got some very smart people giving me lots of advice about what I should do in order to fix it. But again, in my copious free time, right? Sometimes I have to do plugins rather than working on a hardware device. I'd love to be able to find somebody that could fix it, but so far I've yet to find anybody that was willing to recondition those things, because that's the kind of thing where I'd be looking for somebody to do it for me. I don't feel like working with broken stuff. I'd rather work with kits of stuff, and then if I break them, I'll try harder and I'll do another one. Maybe then the other one will work. Stuff like this. I build these things, and again, one of the things, although before going off on that tangent, I should also mention that since I don't have the tape echo, I have brought in some of my older digital delay things. The question, however, is would I be able to replicate them? Like, I'm pointing at a Delta Labs Effectron. It's an Effectron 2. It's the kind that has the long echo. I more or less decided, like, I'm never going to get that Space Echo working again. So let's bring these out. I have 2 of them, and I've got one of them sitting on the Moog, and I've got one of them patched into actually my guitar rig. And it's replacing a, God, what the hell was it anyway? A very reputable sort of faux tape delay pedal. I'm trying super hard to remember what the hell it was. But it's a same people that do the Ditto, TC Electronics. And I was using their stomp box, and it's pretty darn good, their stomp box. Their stomp box lets you do sort of tape style echoes and various things. You can set it so that it gives you a backwards effect, and that was lovely. I played that live a number of times when I was doing the streams and things, which might start happening again in February if all goes well. And it has a dry pass-through, so it does not necessarily digitize the dry signal. It's not necessarily a hard bypass pass-through, but it is a undigitized dry pass-through. And the thing about it is, it's pretty good. It sounded pretty good. It was down there on the floor, so if I was trying to synchronize my echoes to what I was playing, I couldn't reach it and do that very easily. And it might be the flashback. Because it was way down, I have to like climb down to the floor to do it. So I replaced it with the Effectron, which has its own sort of qualities. But one of the neat things about the Effectron, the same conversation with the Space Echo, Effectrons have a strange way of running into aliasing, as in they kind of won't. And I can easily believe that. It's not like they're perfectly clean and pure, because they're not. But if you're using old Delta Lab Effectrons, and these things, sometimes you can pick them up for like $60 or so. They are not, these are the long delay ones, so they might run for a little bit more. You can also get ones that do just the flange or chorusing or doubling or whatever, and those will be even cheaper. And there's a guy in the same forum where I was getting advice on how to fix the Space Echo, talking about his experience with the Effectrons, and he was like, they do not alias. I cannot make it alias. And I was like, oh, really? I would have thought it would just alias differently. And he's like, nope. You start running frequencies that are too high, and you get nothing but a blasted noise out of it. And that's because it is not generating the kind of digital audio that we work with in the box. Instead, it's generating the kind of digital audio that you get off of like an SACD or a DSD recorder. It's a bit stream of very high frequency stuff. And this is not the only way to get that. There is, I think, a PT2399 chip that you can get like 10 of them for $18 on Amazon quite easily. And that chip goes into a lot of currently made boutique effects devices and things. Like Dreadbox makes synthesizers that use this chip in it. And it does basically the same kind of thing. So that is like, as far as additional delay plugins, I can't actually replicate that. Or at least I can't replicate it in a direct way. I could possibly do something where it's like, let's just distort and weird out the highs to simulate this DSD process kicking in so that your highs turn into just a bunch of noise. Sounds almost like what I was doing in Chrome Oxide, and Chrome Oxide is on the table for bringing back, but I can't literally do what that does any more than I can literally do what a tape echo does. So it's a question of what kinds of things can I bring in, and famously my it's the one that David Pixley is always going on about, trolls me with, that, help me out, guys. What's that thing David always jokes about, where it takes stuff and uses the telecommunications processing to sort of compress stuff and then uncompress it on the output so that it'll suppress noise to some extent? U-Law, that's the one. So U-Law is part of what I'm doing with the request for early bad digital delays at the companding and such and stuff. That's one way to do that kind of thing, is to incorporate it along with a bit crusher in your audio. So U-Law is a way of getting stuff in there. It doesn't do limiting sample rates though. And I do have sample rate crushers as well, but some of that stuff, like, you could, if you were willing to have, you could use any digital delay and just stick one of those on the input, stick some of that stuff on the input, and you would be getting like a mangled result. Or you could stick U-law and then the bit pressure and then the U-law decode. And you would get a mangled result that was mangled in a different way that was more like the old school stuff. But it's a good question as to whether I'd be wanting to literally get into emulating a specific bad old digital delay. Like if I was going to do something like that, I'd want to do something like the Effectron, simply because some of its behavior is not like bad digital stuff. It's very differently. And if it is never cheap around where you live, that's a shame, because that's one of the challenges. You start talking about things like that. It's possible with some things, if I emulate them super well, then the desire goes away for being able to have the real ones, but then I tend to like the real ones. Speaking of which, I can introduce you to a little toy which I only hinted at. Check it out. I can work on the seriously a little harder now, which is not to guarantee that I can do this instantly or that the work is going to give fruit instantly. But thanks to the guy that was showing up and offering to let me, use his and just send it to me, I was like, no, actually, I'll buy it from you. This is it. I bought it. It is a SM2 SRS. It's Crate's licensed version of the SRS with the knobs like space and center and without the weird hyperboost stuff. So this is probably about as close to the unit that Chad had, which is not in perfectly working condition. And my next order of business, which I might even be doing today, if I can get it together to do it, you can see that I've got 1/8" jacks, which I have built of jacks and plugs and things on this. What I'm going to do to try to figure this out is take my modular system and use the triggers. The trigger pulses, which are very, very brief, little spikes. They're like direct pulses, but not. Run those into the inputs left and right. I'll probably have it do center pulse, left pulse, right pulse, center pulse, left pulse, right pulse, because I want to hear what the thing does when it gets a little transient spike. I already know to some extent the frequency stuff that it does, but I'm going to have to figure out the delay stuff because I'm missing that. And if I'm able to do that, and more relevantly, rather than literally trying to clone what it does, I want to get in the ballpark. I want to reverse engineer the stuff that it's doing and maybe think of a better way to do it rather than exactly duplicating what they did with it. Because, this used to be patent protected, and there's still a company that's frantically trying to license it to places, and it's like in Winamp and stuff now. So I'm not all that interested in being like, hi, I've taken all your intellectual property, but I should be able to figure out something that gets you more into the zone as far as the weird spacey delays stuff going on, and that can be thrown into seriously. In fact, I would be willing to add that to seriously as like additional controls and update it in place. Because it seems kind of like people, while they value the just overtone version of it, people, including Chad, who originally asked for it, want that time delay stuff in there too. And if I can isolate it and separate it out, maybe in such a way where if I can make two different ones, and one of them is like sides and the other one is center, and isolate the tone stuff versus the time delay fooling around stuff, then you'd be able to use that kind of thing, but dial in the degree to which the tone stuff is happening or the degree to which the time delay stuff is happening. And therefore it'll be more adaptable to your purposes. And that's the goal there. Which is not to say that it's able to happen right away, because it's like this assumes I'm able to figure it out. For all I know, it won't behave in any kind of predictable way when you give it just pulses. But much like with the recording of the Roland Space Echo stuff, much like that, I ought to be able to get test recordings of it And if I do that, this is not something that I've done yet, but if I do that, I can also share the test recordings, like maybe on the Patreon or something, so that people who are being patrons can be like, oh, here, have my test files. You can literally hear what the sound of the recording of it can be on the Evergreens place or whatever, that like, here, have a test recording of a Roland Space Echo with a 1K tone, a 1K sign going onto it while I fool around with it. And then if you can make any better use of that than I can, that's cool. I'm trying to do the open source and collaborative kind of thing. Maybe somebody else will be able to discern things about that I wasn't even able to discern. It would be cool. So let me keep an eye on our chat while we're going, because we're getting on towards the end of well, it's not the end of my workday because I have a pile of other stuff to do. I'm really excited about taking these jacks and plugging them into this and doing a more elaborate version of this, because this is how I made my kick drum, the Blue Lantern kick drum, which has a million weird inputs. This is how I distribute stuff from certain envelope outputs and things to other inputs, and I got a bunch of ideas as far as what I want to do with it. I'm very excited about that. So I want, until I have that going on, it's like I'm not even done. I'm not even ready to do music again until that's working. But soon enough, I will be done with the Q&A talking on stream part of the day. So let me have a glance at our chat while we go. Oh, so Ahmed is talking about spectral dynamics. You see, some of the stuff that you're asking me to do with the sorting algorithm plugin, that see whether maybe that'll happen like 10 years from now. I couldn't really tell you. I don't see any way of doing it, so it ain't happening. But that spectral processing stuff, Ahmed is absolutely right. I've played with it, and that is sometimes something that you can do. You could be taking a waveform, isolate the highest peak waveform, and then do constructive solid geometry style stuff to isolate the fundamental and then subtract that. So, yup. That said, when you do FFT processing like the spectral processing, I hate the sound of that stuff. So it's not necessarily going to get you something that I would like. But it is something that you can do. And I believe you can freely download that stuff. There's a spectral processing kit that you can get. I forget exactly how or where, but you can get that. Yeah, Stephen is observing that seriously, which is intended to have a SRS stereo enhancement quality, that was really kind of the whole point. Has coding aspects that lend itself to monitoring and HRTF tuning mixing applications. Well, yeah, because the frequencies that it boosts were chosen by Hughes Corporation initially for that exact reason. Like, that's why they chose the really narrow boosts that are part of the EQ side of it, and the EQ side of it is what I implemented. It was done in a popular mechanics article that glossed over the time delay stuff that they were doing, but made drawings of the specific boosts that they used in like side and left and right and mono and behind the head and stuff like that. They specifically outlined which frequency boosts you used, and I was able to look at that and go like, okay, let's do those. And that's what Seriously is so far. Seriously needs to add the time delay stuff that the real thing uses, because that's what it's lacking. And I'd like to do it in such a way that it's kind of a distinct thing rather than it's never going to be literally a clone. But I'm going to learn as much as I can about how they did their stuff. And go with that. Now let's see. A drawing board, Chris. Well, I'm kind of back to the drawing board, Chris, fairly often. Kick drums. I really enjoy trying to optimize kick drums. There is a modular synthesizer developer who works on kick drums that I quite enjoy a lot. It's the guy from Rabbit Elephant. I think he is pretty cool. He's taken to doing these things like the low-pass gate, the Vactrol-based low-pass gate, and the kick drum unit, and doing these sort of Ferrari-like ultra modular system modules where it's like, you can buy it, it's going to cost you $2,000. Or maybe not $2,000 unless you have a scalper selling it to you, but it's like, okay, you can buy my kick drum thing. You know, Blue Lanterns is going to cost you $130 or $180, or the simplest one might be $70. And this guy's kick drum module is going to cost you like $700 or $800. Oh, but you can't get them because they're already sold out. And I kind of love that. It's like he is doing the thing where he's isolating some of the problems. Because you can have problems with kick drum synthesis. Witness, say, Bastel's attempt at a kick drum synthesizer. Bastel does something called a T-kick, and I consider it to be the ultimate, like, Berlin school, flabby, lame, old-style synthesizer kick. I don't feel that it's particularly useful for modern techniques at all. It is the Bastel T-kick is as far as you can possibly get from like the noise engineering Bassimilis Ceteritas Alter, which is a very synthetic sounding thing. And that's all because of the envelope. The envelope of the Bastel is like, no, no, no. And you have to have a punch to it. It has to be a spike and then fall away, which the Bastel doesn't. The Bastel doesn't do a spike in the frequency either. And the Blue Lantern has a bit more of a spike, but what I end up doing is I'm taking the envelope output of the Blue Lantern and like running that through this capacitor to a input, which is, I've done it both on the amplitude envelope and on the frequency envelope, and with this new project I'm going to be doing both. So that only the front spike of the voltage spike goes through to further enhance it, and that's going to exaggerate the spikiness of it even more. So I can have a base envelope that is slower, and then dial in an additional sort of punch on either the frequency or the amplitude or both in such a way that I can just give it a little bit more wham in the very beginning of it, and also dictate where that's going to sit in the frequency range. And I have this capacitor here, which is shorted to ground. So the output of that spike will not only be additional spike on the front of the attack, but it'll also be softened. Rather than being like instant to the top and then down, it'll slow its attack so that it'll go up and then back down again. And that means that the frequency will swoop up at incredibly high speed to its highest pitch and then go back down again, which will soften the kind of, it'll change the kind of attack that you get. And also the amplitude will swoop up to the loudest possible amount and then come back down again for the additional boost that you put. And these things just contribute to the punchiness of the kick drum enormously. And that's what the Rabbit Elephant guy has been doing. There's an old thread on like Muff Wiggler where they're talking about what is your ultimate kick drum module, and people have all kinds of ideas around it. And this guy shows up and he's like, actually, none of the above. I'd rather make it out of individual modules, like $1,000 of individual envelope and frequency modules. because the stuff I need to do with the envelopes, like what I'm talking about with this here, is too complicated to use from a simple module. I have to do more things than that. And then he turns around and starts putting out a kick drum module, which is selling for like over $600 and is sold out. You're not going to be able to get one because the idea is it is so amazing. Also bear in mind, like if you're making an envelope like this, you can also distort it, in which case your spike going up here and then falling back can be going up there flat topped because it's distorting and then falling back. So there's a lot of ways to do that kind of thing. And control of the frequency and amplitude envelope of the kick drum is essential to making stuff that is really fierce. And I've gotten better at doing that over the years. I started out with a Moog DFAM, which is pretty amazing, but even then, I was coming up with stuff like this. I was running one of the DFAM's envelope outputs through a transformer and back into a amplitude, into a DCA, so that I could exaggerate the amplitude kick of it with a signal that was like the envelope spike, but it couldn't do DC, so it had to give up pretty fast, and it also couldn't do ultimate speed attack, so it softened things. And that started giving me a kick that was even better than the basic DFAM kick that you can do, which is already pretty amazing. And then when I got the Blue Lantern, which is pretty amazing in its own right, and it's a lot more kind of electro, harsh, aggressive. It's kind of like a Jomox or something. It's a lot more aggressive and fierce by default, and then I've been working ever since to try to incorporate some of the warmth and bigness that the DFAM could do while keeping the added aggression that it has. So what I'm going to be doing there with this bank of jacks and capacitors and things is the envelope will go to some jacks where I can have a output, different outputs for how fast it affects different things, and the Blue Lantern has input trims on all of that stuff coming back in, so that's real handy. And I'll have very slow large capacitors for adding a lot of extra thump that doesn't die away very quickly, and then tiny ones for just adding the briefest little spike, which would be clicks, not kicks, much like Privacy is saying. But also, the raw output of it, I am going to run into this device and then filter the highs, because the Blue Lantern has a built-in click generator. And the thing about it is that click generator is really aggressive and fierce, and it goes up super high in frequency, but it's too high in frequency. I can't really use it because it doesn't merge with the kick as well as I would like. And I like those warmer, bigger kicks where maybe it'll hit with a lot of mid-range thump, but I'm not so interested in a high frequency click being on top of that, as if the click is like right up at the surface of the speaker. So I want it to be solid but more buried. And if I filter the output with a simple capacitor to ground, I'll be able to bring in the click circuit and have it merge a little better. But at the same time, I can also take the same capacitor or one much like it and run it to another jack and run that to the FM synth input, where not only am I having a fundamental like kick waveform, which is kind of like a triangle, but you can soften it a little bit. The Blue Lantern gives you a special distortion thing where you could take it all the way from triangle to slightly dirty to square wave if you wanted. And if I put the overtones on FM, I can change the color and texture of it substantially. And if I filter that, which it may or may not be the same frequency as I'm rolling off, then I can doctor the whole behavior of the higher frequency zone, where it's just the the attack hitting, I might be able to do really weird things with that sound amazing. So, and you know, these are all things that you can also do if you're doing everything in like VCD Rack or designing stuff. You know, these analog things, and I'd really like to get it to where people can explore things with, like, sell you a kit where you can get a pile of capacitors and a pile of these little plugs and things, and then to start making stuff. I'm moving towards being able to do that. But the things that are learned with that are things that can relate to a classic DAW situation. And you can learn how to do stuff like that and have plugins and ways of generating sounds where you can learn from those lessons. So, that said, we're going to tack in a little test word on here. Yeah, everything changes. I have a new camera stand here, so I can make it wobble, which is not great, but every little bit, you know, I keep trying to improve things bit by bit. And we have blown right past the time when I said I was going to shut off, and that's fine. So it's time for me to head on my way and do more stuff towards all of these goals. I'll see what I can get done. And I will see if it turns out that I do another Evergreens, that'll come out like Sunday. If I have another plugin, that'll come out Sunday, as you might well expect. And I'll be seeing you guys again on Monday, because this is my time of catching up with people. So yeah. And you're quite welcome for the input on kicks, because it's always, I think, best when I get super interested in something and then start ranting happily about it and explaining it. That is something which I'm hot to finish doing today. I can definitely solder like this many jacks in a day with no trouble whatsoever. And I'm looking to get that set up so that I can start running sounds through this and get all that rolling as well. But for the time being, what I'm going to do is say catch you guys later. Goodbye to chat. And goodbye to you all. And I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.